So, what is meant by a congested area as it relates to FAA regulations? Well, this one's a bit complicated because the FAA does not define congested area or open air assembly of persons, and that's because each scenario presents its own risks. So, there's not just one legal interpretation, but there are multiple FAA legal interpretations, guidance, memos, advisory circulars, NTSB documents, and case law surrounding this specific issue. And all of those documents have one thing in common, and that is that the FAA recognizes there is no single definition for congested area or open air assembly of persons. But what that doesn't mean is that this is a gray area, because they provide you with a ton of guidance to help you make a safe and legal decision when you're out there flying. So these guidance documents are talking about the intent, and the intent that the FAA has for you keeping a higher altitude and a further distance away from congested areas is so that they can protect people on the ground. And generally, when they are talking about congested areas and open air assemblies, they're talking about larger gatherings of persons in smaller areas. So let's start out by taking a look into the regulation. So there's a couple key parts to this reg right off the bat that we need to make sure we understand. The first being the first sentence, which says, except when necessary for takeoff and landing, you essentially don't need to comply with the rest of the regulation. So if you're doing an approach and a landing or a takeoff and departure over a congested area, as long as it's necessary for takeoff and landing, you don't need to comply with that regulation. Now, they make it clear that you can't take advantage of that part of the reg. So you can't go a mile north of the airport and be doing your ground reference maneuvers and say you're still within the traffic pattern, because the FAA does not consider that necessary for takeoff and landing. Now, the next part is anywhere. So forget the rest of the regulation for a second. Anytime you are flying, you have to be at an altitude where if you lose an engine, you can make an emergency landing without causing hazard to persons and property on the ground. Now, let's get into the congested area part of the reg. So with congested areas, the FAA talks about cities, towns, settlements, and open air assemblies of persons. We're used to looking at our sectional charts and seeing those yellow areas and associating those with congested areas. And those are a great starting point because they are highly populated areas. But the FAA also makes it clear that you can't just use those areas for planning. You have to know the NOTAMs and the local area to where you're flying and what you're wanting to do for your mission to make the best decision when you're out there determining whether it's congested or not. So cities and towns, I think, are pretty easy for us to figure out where those are so that we can know whether those are congested or not. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky is settlements and open air assemblies of persons. So they don't specifically define a number of houses or a number of persons within a square mileage, but they do give a handful of examples. So within these examples, they talk about 10 houses that are close together next to a school being a congested area. They talk about 20 houses in a residential area being close together as being congested areas. And so they really rely on each specific scenario, because you might have 5 houses that are really close together that may be close to a major highway, and that major highway adds into the persons in that area. So you have a small area with a large grouping of persons that could be considered congested. Now, when it comes to open air assembly of persons, again, they don't define a specific amount, but they give a lot of examples, like a busy beach or a ball game or a funeral where there's a lot of people in a single area, or they talk about a picnic area where there's a large gathering of persons. So you might be out there flying today and doing ground reference maneuvers near a church that's out in the middle of nowhere, and there's usually no people there, but maybe today they have service going on and there's 20 cars in the parking lots. That could be considered a congested area because it's a large gathering of persons in a small area. So really, you have to take into account every scenario when you are out there flying. And if you just have to fly in that area, either sidestep it by 2,000 feet and find a better area that's more sparsely populated, Or if you have to do it, contact your local flight standards district office and request a waiver. They're either going to approve the waiver or deny it because you just don't have enough risk mitigation in there and you can't show that it's within the public interest. So, one takeaway from all of this is don't consider this a gray area. Take all of the guidance that they give you so that you can make a safe, sound, and legal decision when you're out there planning and when you're actually out there flying. Let me know if this helps you out. I'll see you next time.